Please welcome Brian today.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate that. Just so you know, if you want something to do this weekend, you're close by, we're open. As Bill said, we are been talking about Strategic Air Command and deterrence in the early Cold War. When you talk to historians and they talk about the Cold War, they all kind of differ a bit on when the Cold War started and actually how long it lasted. I'm not going to cover that. We're gonna focus on the 1950s because that is what our focus is about. But I always wanted to talk about is how did we get to a Cold War? I mean, in 1941 we were pulled into a World War. How did we end up in a Cold War? So first of all, we look at basically some things that were key points to it that go to the 1950s. 1950, the National Security Council basically issued a report that they were going off the premise that once the Soviet Union has sufficient atomic capacity, they will attack us. That was the premise. And that was just based off the fact that in 1949, the Soviet Union had dropped their first atomic bomb. And they didn't have much else to go by other than, because all through the war and just after, the Soviet Union was very closed off. But based off of that, the Security Council, their recommendation was to have the rapid buildup of the political, economic, and military strength of the free world. And of course, to do that, you have to, first of all, increase your economy, because you have to have the money to spend on this. Within a matter of a few years, the budget for the military had jumped up almost 200%. And part of that has to do with deterrence. The U.S. wanted to take a role of deterrence rather than outright aggression towards the Soviet Union. And we became basically embattled in a war of technology. How are we going to innovate? How are we going to accomplish this? We're going to go back just a little bit and talk what brought us up to some of this. First of all, World War II, you had strategic bombing. Military aviation actually goes all the way back to World War I, though they weren't really doing bombing unless, definitely not strategic bombing, unless you take a pilot from a Jenny who decides to drop a hand grenade or a little bomb out of his cockpit as strategic bombing. They weren't really doing it. By World War II, actually you go back, we've got the B-17, you go back to 1935. We had the B-10 before then. We were building bombers specifically for these reasons and getting more technologically advanced. By 1935, the B-17 was the largest aircraft to ever leave American soil. As I was talking to folks earlier, we jumped ahead in 1955, and now you have the B-52, which actually wasn't the largest at the time, you had the B-52 before, but we'll get into that later. In strategic bombing, you had both the Pacific and the European theater. During World War II, strategic bombing dropped over 1.4 million tons of bombs on enemies. The devastation of that was astounding. All this goes into play as what the Soviet Union is seeing that we're doing. It's their clamoring during World War II for us to create another front against the Germans to relieve them. In 1942, Germany attacks the Soviet Union, even though they have an agreement, non-aggression pact. Germany does this because they want to get you by surprise. The Soviet Union is struggling. They are not equipped to go up against a huge mechanized army as Germany, so they want us to start another front. The U.S. is focusing on trying to eliminate Germany's ability to produce more war products, to produce their tanks, artillery shells, all these things. So we go by with strategic bombing. That's why we've got all this ordnance. This is also destroying a lot of Europe. Because Germany didn't just sit in Germany and build, they kept expanding. In the Pacific, we had our B-29, a technological marvel for strategic bombing. They had a fully pressurized cockpit, making it easier for the crews to go on these longer missions. They changed their tactics because things were changing. The destruction that they achieved was just unthinkable at the time. Out of 60 plus targeted cities, they had 33 of those were 50% or more destroyed, the whole city. The city of Toyama actually was 99% destroyed by these strategic bombing missions. The Soviet Union is seeing this. They're understanding that not just the US, but the Allies have this incredible military destructive force. And as some animosity and tensions build between those, that's where you start seeing that Cold War, that escalation of technology and of force. So then we've got Yalta and Potsdam. Obviously there were several meetings with what we call the Big Three: England, Soviet Union, and US in World War II, largely to discuss, early on, it's to discuss how are we going to defeat Germany. Then you have to discuss, once they're defeated, what does that look like? How's this going to shake up? And what's going to happen? So you've got the Yalta Conference, which was in February of 1945. You had Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin there. And Stalin was pushing for what was previously discussed, like we're talking about, the spheres of influence. And this, to me, is starting to set that tone for the Cold War. Because the Soviet Union wants to expand. One is they want to be into Europe, because that gives them a greater economy, greater resources, plus they want to build stronger ports. You get that, you can increase your economy through trade. And previous to this, and I believe it was October of 42, 43, Churchill went to Moscow and had what they called the Moscow Conference with Stalin, did not include the US. At which time, that's when Churchill was floating the idea to the Soviet Union, to Stalin, the idea of spheres of influence. This concept is that where each nation has some influence, that area, they dictate how that nation progresses. This is largely how we develop our Eastern Bloc countries for the Soviet Union. One of the things the Soviet Union always aspired to, Russia always aspired, even through the Tsarist years, that they need buffer territory. Because if you look at the geology, the geography of Russia, the western side, where their capital is, where most of their people are, is somewhat flat, unless you get down to the Ural Mountains, somewhat flat. This is why so many European nations could attack. This is why Napoleon got all the way to Moscow. And of course, he wasn't smart enough to understand that the Russians have a scorched earth policy, so you have absolutely no resources once you get there and your supply lines will be strung out. The Germans ran into the same issue. The Russians have always known that if we just retreat into ourselves, they can never overtake us completely, unless you're the Mongols. All right, so then we get into Potsdam. So Churchill's had this meeting with Stalin. We have spheres of influence idea kind of floating around. In Yalta, they're talking about, at that point, when this war ends, how are we going to rebuild? How are we going to administer these nations? So that's where Stalin is pushing for this. When they get to Potsdam, they're now talking about specifically how do we divide up Germany. At which point, when they talk about these things, they're talking about their sectors. As you see, the Soviet Union has theirs, which includes Berlin, which is obviously, is going to become an issue. The United States, Great Britain, and France. We all have our sectors that we administer. Now, I'll jump ahead again. I don't want to do a spoiler alert here for you, but eventually the Allies join together, and that's how you get East and West Germany. But early on, the Soviet Union is pushing very hard, and they actually want Berlin to be just solely theirs. This becomes, again, a Potsdam Conference, this becomes a very sticking point, and to me really lays that groundwork for the Cold War. We disagree, the US and our allies disagree with the Soviet Union on the administration of Berlin. The Allies went out to begin with, and it was divided up into 4 sectors. And so, of course, you have the Soviet sector over here. I didn't grab any photos for this, but if you go back through time, you look at that, you see this stark comparison You see it today, I guess, you can liken it today, between North and South Korea, what these look like. And that's what you would see in Berlin and in Germany. So that takes us, as we said, we're divided. Now, that's 45, 46 is when they actually get well divided. Over the next couple of years, you have a lot of tensions building. The Soviets wanted to build an economy, but within their system, communism is very difficult to do this. They need a lot of trade, they need a lot of resources. That's why they want more European area. The Allies want to establish it, so as they become their own, basically West Germany, in order to capitalize, they are going to introduce a new currency, which is then going to battle the East German currency, the Deutschmark there. And so they're going to change this, and that's going to cause issues, because on the Allied side, they have the resources to change out that currency pretty much one for one. On the Western side, the Eastern side wants that currency also because it's more valuable than their own, but the Soviet Union does not have the resources, so they're willing to trade it, but not at a favorable rate. The Soviet Union then has to look at what are their alternatives. That's when they decide they're going to blockade Berlin. They're going to close off Western Berlin to the rest of pretty much the West. And so they couldn't block, because of the agreements, they couldn't block air routes in, but they could block all the roads, railways, rivers, everything. So, and all this happened just overnight. They block all this off. And now the Allies are looking at the fact that what the Soviets are trying to do is they're trying to starve out West Berlin so that they will just have to be given to the East just to survive. The Allies come up with a different idea. General LeMay was one of them who played a big role in this, was can't we fly our aircraft in, drop off supplies, and then fly back out? In the original division, they had specific routes they could fly in and then fly back out. As long as they stayed within those corridors, they were safe. Unless, of course, the Soviet Union decides not to honor that. So pretty much the U.S. starts pushing, and the Allies push all of the cargo aircraft into West Germany, and they're realizing the millions and millions of tons of food, fuel, everything to keep it alive, but they get that done. And eventually the Soviet Union has to capitulate and open the borders back up. They know they can't do this. But this is often seen as the really first step in the conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. It wasn't a shooting conflict, but it was one where the two ideologies are standing off against each other. And so that's where I look at, and that kind of brings us up, that's 1948 and 1949, that's bringing us up to the 1950s. That becomes a very tense period in the Cold War. A lot of folks focus on that as really the start of it. You have a lot of events leading up. My feeling is actually it's more at Potsdam and Yalta where this is starting. And so you've got to say there's a Cold War there because they're competing and they're trying to get the upper hand. This was an overt action. The Soviet Union closes off a section. The Allies defy it. It wasn't a hot conflict, but it is setting everything up. And then as I talked about, 1949, and you have the Soviet Union detonating their first atomic bomb. It was about 22 kilotons. It wasn't something major, but the fact that they had that they could do that, it is known that they were able to get that technology to develop that through basically Operation Paperclip like we had, where we were retrieving German scientists for the rocketry. We already had the atomic bomb, the fission concept, which we actually got from German scientists also, an Italian scientist, but that was before the war. Now that we know they have this, now it's escalating even more. It's now becoming an arms race. We're ahead in the arms race. We have more atomic bombs. We think we have more bombers, though there is a report that comes out in 1950 that claims there's a bomber. Now, of course, it's being proven wrong. that the Soviet Union really doesn't have that many. When we're doing reconnaissance, we find out that they know where we're gonna fly, so they pre-position these bombers there, and then when they know we're gonna go someplace else, they move them over here. They wanna present this view that they have all these weapons, when really it's just a shell game. So that gets us into 1950, and now we're at a hot war. We've got Korea. The history that you probably know about Korea. At the end of World War II, Korea gets divided, kind of like Germany. It gets divided in half in the 38th parallel. And this was an agreement with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union wanted to have influence. China is going to play a part in this also, but it's not until after division and before 1950. But you have a communist movement in the north, and they are seeking assistance from China and from the Soviet Union. And at first, they're not getting any love. They're not getting any love from either. Kim Il-sung, who's the leader of North Korea, he ventures out to the Soviet Union to meet with Stalin, to meet with Mao Zedong in China, trying to get resources, trying to get support, because he wants to unify the Koreas. Again, it comes down to unifying to get more resources. The South is being heavily supported by the Allies, by the United States. And so when you look at the difference in economies, South Korea is doing really well. North Korea wants to do well, but they don't have that support. So they're looking for that, and they think they can take it by force. So I was saying July 1950, they invade the South. And that brings us into the war, which initially just looks as though it is North Korea versus South Korea. We are already allies with South, so we're going to help them. It's after we push, after the Incheon landing in 1950, after we push all the way to the Yalu River, that the Chinese then send the People's Liberation Army across the river and push the Allied forces all the way back down to the tip of the peninsula, to the Pusan perimeter. And then as our forces push back up, all this is happening in 6 months. Just big pushes of forces all around until it kind of starts stabilizing back on the 38th parallel, moving back and forth across there. But it's also when you start to see Soviet fighters in the mix, Soviet arms coming through. You've got Chinese influx of people into there. Eventually you have Soviet instructors training the pilots, eventually just flying the aircraft themselves. Now we are seeing a very hot war between the East and the West that is going to have this big ripple effect back in the United States. Part of this then is, we're going to go jump back a little bit again. I didn't want to go chronologically because I think it's real confusing. 1946, the United States knew we already have our atomic weapons. We already have our bombers. We've already proven that. How do we use this to have a show of force, or at least a show of capability to the Soviet Union to try to keep them at bay? And part of it is you create a force that flexes that controls that. That was Strategic Air Command. They created that in 1946. They combined the Continental Air Command and some Tactical Air Command and some other forces to create this. Now it started off very small, and unfortunately I think within 2 years it got smaller, but eventually it grew. The whole concept is that they would be very visible. This wasn't going to be a secret, it's going to be visible, and they want the Soviets to see this as a deterrence. It was a deterrence based by strength. Originally starting out in Bowling Field, Maryland, the Pentagon, they saw that it's going to be more beneficial to move it somewhere central. Pretty much like that's how Nebraska got the Martin bomb plant. You want to make it harder for your adversaries to get to it. So they moved Strategic Air Command headquarters to Offutt Air Force Base. This actual building, that was the first office building they had there. And General Kinney, who was the original commander for SAC, he was there 46 into 48. But General LeMay came in, who was considered the father of SAC, in 48, just as the headquarters was being moved. And LeMay's directive, his vision, was to create the most powerful force on Earth so that nobody wants to mess with you. it sort of goes back to, you think of Teddy Roosevelt, where you talk softly but carry a big stick. And so then, I say Offutt was a big thing. And since we're basically here talking about 1950s in Nebraska, how did Nebraska play this role in the deterrence? We already established that the United States is going to deter the Soviet Union by showing that we have a greater force than they do. In Nebraska, Nebraska ended up having 4 Strategic Air Command air bases. A lot of folks, we all focus on Offutt. One is because Offutt's still there. It was the headquarters. It was the last base to transition away from SAC. You also had Grand Island, Nebraska, which they had B-29s based there, but only for about a year. And the reason that they transitioned that out wasn't because they didn't need it. It was largely because that was a training base during World War II, largely for B-29 crews, but they didn't keep it up. Once the war ended, the Army Air Forces pretty much left the base and did nothing. The city didn't know what to do if they didn't have a plan for it. So when SAC moved in a year later, they discovered that a lot of the barracks, a lot of things were falling apart. They were deteriorating. So they kept the base open for a year, and then they closed it and moved those aircraft, actually moved them to Kearney. So Kearney was a base that also was stood up in 1946 for SAC, and it was maintained much better. They had B-29s there. Later on, that base stayed open until about 1966. The B-29s, the bombers transitioned out, and they actually moved fighters there. SAC was organized. They were a self-contained, a self-sufficient force. It wasn't just bombers, but they had their tanker aircraft, they had fighter escort aircraft, they had all their cargo aircraft, everything support they needed, so they could function independently. So fighters during the Cuban Missile Crisis, F-102s were actually based, they were moved to Kearney in order to basically keep them safe. And it was actually, when Tactical Air Command took over the fighters, they liked it so much they kept them there for another 4 years. So 1960s, that's when that base shut down. The other base, yes, Lincoln Air Force Base. This was one that stuck around for a long time also. It was a very good base. They maintained it, they upgraded it. The height of it, they had B-47 squadrons and wings there and KC-97s. And so it really became a very, very active atmosphere in the 1950s and 60s. And eventually they closed it down, but then that actually went back to an era where Strategic Air Command budget cuts are happening. One is your technology is making things more efficient, but it's also the U.S. government is understanding that we just can't constantly keep pouring more and more in. We have to learn to scale down. But there's actually, Lincoln Air Force Base has a great, incredible story. One of my favorites, I met a gentleman who was a navigator on KC-97s. He started his career at Lincoln with the 98th Refueling Squadron. He bounced around the Air Force for 20 years and ended his career in Lincoln as they closed the squadron down. So it's just amazing. And he was not originally from Nebraska, but he did settle here. We'll talk about aircraft here. Obviously, Offutt is the big one. That became the headquarters, but they flew bombers out of there from time to time. Right now, at the end of their SAC's career, it was largely just reconnaissance or command control. But we also want to look at what was the innovations, what was SAC's innovations for deterrence in the Cold War. Well, as I said, they started off, with B-29s. That's what they had. Those were our atomic aircraft. And then they moved to the B-50s. And you look at this, and everyone, and we do this with our visitors, they look at this and say, what's the difference? And largely it's a longer wingspan, more powerful engines, and extra fuel tanks, and a larger tail for stability, stabilizers, all for stability, greater range, and a heavier bomb load. They called it, instead of calling it, say, a B-29K model, they called it a B-50 because so many things had changed on it that they almost had to refabricate the aircraft. And then going on, You go up to the B-36. As I talked about before, the largest aircraft leaving American soil. That's the largest bomber America's ever built. You've got an aircraft that's 185 feet long and nearly a 300-foot wide wingspan, carrying 60,000 pounds. The biggest advantage of all this, and this again, it's one of the loose nicknames it has, is the big stick. And it's not because it's long and straight. It's because of the range. This aircraft had a range, fully loaded, it could have an unrefueled range of over 9,000 miles. It was originally being designed by Convair in World War II because early on we were concerned that Great Britain is going to fall to the Germans. If they fall, we can only fight the war from our own soil. We had no aircraft that could make that flight and back. So early on, we're flying B-17s there. We fly them there. They have to land in England, and they have to get refueled. They couldn't fly to Germany. They just couldn't make that flight. So Convair was building this. By the time they had design and some testing done, we were convinced Great Britain's going to hold on. We were able to resupply them. We were able to help them, and then we could launch our war from there. So that got put on the shelf. And after the war, when SAC was created, this slowly started to come out. By 1946, they were testing, actually doing flight tests with them. By 1949, this was operational. So this was a big deterrence. We had let the Soviet Union know that we can fly an aircraft from our soil to their soil, drop bombs, and return. We had that capability. So that was the big role for the B-36. Now the B-36 wasn't based out of Nebraska, but both Offutt and Lincoln had their runways extended to accommodate them should we ever need to do this. So that is how Nebraska maintains that role of deterrence within there. And this is just a comparison of the B-29 to a B-36. You can see that size comparison. To me, it's just phenomenal that you get an aircraft fully loaded with bombs and fuel. The B-36 weighs over 400,000 pounds. When they first built the aircraft, you can see here, you've got 6 what they call pusher prop engines. Eventually they add 4 jet engines on it. One is to help get it off the ground in the allotted space they have, but it actually was to add basically more ordnance to the aircraft, to make the aircraft heavier. It is the largest bomber ever built, but it also never dropped a bomb in any conflict. So I guess that deterrence worked. But then we also look at 1950s. I would say the more perfection of air-to-air refueling has occurred. It was being done prior to 1950s, but the U.S. Boeing was building the KC-97, a refueling aircraft, we call it a tanker, but they were also building the B-47. The B-47 was the U.S.'s first swept-wing all-jet bomber. It was also able to refuel. That means that the range of this aircraft is now unlimited, as long as you can get tankers out there. And these are being based in Lincoln. They're on alert, so should anything start with the Soviet Union, they can be scrambled. The tankers take off first, and it's interesting is because they actually will refuel each other to get farther out, so the jets will get refueled farther out. Their route is actually north of over Canada and around, so it's a shorter route. Now the B-47 wasn't the first jet bomber, the B-45 was, but it had a straight wing, it was horribly underpowered, and it just kind of became a bit of a slug. It turned out to be a better reconnaissance aircraft. The B-47 was phenomenal. One is its high speed, very maneuverable. It didn't have a huge payload, but a lot of times when you come out with a new type of aircraft, they don't. You have to do more development with it. But it did lead Boeing, who built this, to build the B-52. That became operational in 1955. It first flew in 53, operational in 55. We actually have the first operational one in the museum, a little plug there. But you also had the KC-135. Now you have a jet tanker aircraft. That's going to have greater range, greater speed. One of the problems is, between these two, is the KC-97 has to fly as fast as it possibly can, sometimes going into a shallow dive, whereas the B-47 has to slow up to almost stall speed so they can match that speed. The KC-135 is able to better accommodate both aircraft. Now you have a very heavy bomber carry huge loads, unlimited range. With this, the U.S. and Nebraska is setting the tone with the Soviet Union is, we can reach you with all our bombers. And you look at the time frame on these, we're going from the B-29 in 1946 to B-52 in 1955. We are making huge jumps in technology and innovation. The Soviet Union had come out with the Bear bomber, Tu-95, which is a turboprop-driven aircraft. They are still using that today. They did eventually develop jet bombers, but their mainstay is the Bear bomber, where ours is the B-52. So basically winning that innovation is what, obviously helps deter your adversaries. Another innovation of the 1950s, the U-2. First operational in 1956, capable of flying at altitudes greater than 80,000 feet, able to refuel in the air, so now its range is unlimited. And in the 1950s, we started a program where we would overfly the Soviet Union and take the photos. This is a big reason why we discovered that there is not a bomber gap. We're actually winning in that. And as we go back and look at what our plan is, what the U.S. plan is for deterrence, is to build up political, economic, military. Politically, if you know you have either more weapons or greater weapons, a lot of them, they make that stance. So, and it's not aggressive against the Soviet Union. When you look at the full Cold War, we now play a role, and we're going to play a role in Greece, or we're going to play a role in Egypt or somewhere, and the Soviet Union doesn't want that. We have a greater advantage. We get to this. One is our economy stronger, but we have greater military advantage that the Soviet Union has to understand that they can't compete with that. So they have to choose their battles, essentially saying. But other technology comes into play. Missiles. Again, Lincoln Air Force Base also became a missile base. This is an Atlas missile. I did not look to see exactly where this is. Some of you may know where this is in Lincoln. It's like I recognize the building, but I forget the street. But they're moving these out to the air base. And it's first to the air base, and eventually Nebraska had 12 Atlas missile sites. Each missile site has 3 missiles. So 36 missiles in the state of Nebraska, all targeting the Soviet Union. Again, that is our deterrence here, our contribution. It was eventually realized that we probably shouldn't put our deterrent force so close to our headquarters for deterrence. Not a great planning there, but early on you have the Atlas missiles being staged all around. If you ever go around, you can actually go through, I think, the state park or national park system. You can actually find where all these sites were and see them. Fortunately for me, I was up in Meade this past week, and they actually still have the remains of some of the silos there. The Atlas missile is different than most of the other ballistic missiles that we've had. Part of it is it's stored on its side. The skin is so thin, it cannot support itself. How it's stood up is it has a bladder so they fill with the liquid fuel, and then it can stand up, and then they can launch it. It wasn't until the Titan missile that comes out later in the 1950s that we have a solid fuel that they're able to start putting those into silos underground. Okay. All right. So moving along, this is just a launch of that Atlas, and you can see the site there. This is a Titan missile, also in the 1950s. It started off with the Snark missile, which very, very similar to, say, a V-1 rocket in Germany. It has wings. It's launched from above-ground launcher. It has very limited range, but that's where we started. Up above is a Hound Dog missile. That's actually an air-launched cruise missile, but it has an air-breathing engine, so it has much greater range, and those were equipped on the B-52s. The scientists that really worked with this is Italian scientist Enrico Fermi, who basically discovered fission. That's what helps create atomic bombs. Going through several sources, it got brought back to Einstein, and this was a rudimentary concept of showing how fission happens. If any of you are nuclear scientists here, I apologize, I don't want to oversimplify this. I am not. Other benefits from the Cold War. You've got the Interstate System. Eisenhower saw the Autobahn in Germany, brought that concept back into the U.S. 1956, the funding became available. By the 1970s, Nebraska became the first state with a completed interstate system. TV dinner is obviously a big bonus because TVs have now become entering our lives. And it's amazing how quickly we become affectionate to that and want to eat our meals there. But also you have other things that come out of atomic energy research, such as vaccines. But we also have other ways that people have been that were trying to battle the Cold War. You have McCarthyism in 1950, him obviously coming to Nebraska in 1951, and then Nebraska responding to that. You have publications, you have movies where propagandizing this. One is to encourage Americans to stay away from communism, but it's also painting that picture for the rest of the world. McCarthy there, he actually went to KFAB and gave a national presentation. He had support from Nebraska senators early on in 1950. Hazel Abel, who was a Nebraska senator, she's one who actually stood up in 1954 to censor him within within Congress. And so she took that sense saying, you know, it's love your patriotism, but you're going about this the totally wrong way. And then we're getting into the space race. That's another outcome of this. We are now competing with the Soviet Union with this. Early on, they're beating us. They've got Sputnik. They get Yuri Gagarin in space before we can really get a rocket to launch into space safely. But then we follow up with that on Shepard later that year, within 6 months. But now we have the space race, and that's a new competition, but it's also more technology, which is going to help us, and it's more expensive. Now, where all this does come from, though, are the missiles that we talk about. The Atlas missile, eventually the Titan missiles. The Soviets are doing the same thing. They're developing rockets for ballistic missiles and realize they can use those for the space race, or vice versa. Basically, kind of getting into our wrapping up here, what comes after the 1950s? We know we've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we also had the creation of the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff. Those are the folks, largely based out of SAC, that pick the targets in the Soviet Union to hit. They create what's called SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan of how are you now going to hit those targets. By 1962, we have the EC-135 looking glass in the air 24 hours a day. This is a communication hub should the Pentagon be taken out, the White House be taken out, SAC being taken out. There's a general on here who now can give the order to launch bombers or missiles, and they even have the capability to launch the missiles themselves. So this wasn't hidden from the Soviets, this was publicized. We want them to know, no matter what you do, we will always have that capability. That's the interior of it, that's General Chain, he flew on the last mission, and that's what I have. Do I have any questions? Yes.
As a kid growing up in Nebraska in the 1960s,
Yeah.
the narrative was that we were at greater risk because of SAC.
Yep.
That would be the #1 target of the Soviet Union and we would be the first to go.
Yep.
So, my parents preached that in the schools. We did fallout drill, we had fallout shelters and the whole bit. How real was that threat? And how much was it propaganda?
It was very, very real. Research later on, it was understood that Offutt Air Force Base was a primary target. Just as what we had our primary target, secondary target, tertiary targets. What do we want to hit? So if we have our first valley, it was understood that we're really not going to have an all-out, everybody launch everything at the same time. Usually it's a strategic plan of we're going to launch and take out these things and see if the other side is willing to surrender. Offutt Air Force Base was a primary target. For a while, Lincoln was too. They would get hit in the first strike. And it wasn't just the 1960s. I was a high schooler in the 1980s, early 1980s, and it was ingrained in us. We were still doing duck and cover in the locker rooms. We were still doing that practice. They were taking high school kids and developing leadership teams to talk about the Cold War. So it was, I grew up with that also in the 70s and the 80s, and we know that kids from the 50s and 60s were growing up with that also. I really didn't get into the propaganda part of it as much, or civil defense and things like this, because that gets into a whole cultural issue, which some of it is deterrence, some of it is fallout from the deterrence. Any other questions?
Yes. I guess it's several parts to it. But one, LeMay, General LeMay is, in my view, the most well-known commander of SAC.
Yeah.
And is seen as sort of a hero, but then in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was always this gung-ho, nukem kind of guy. And that, in fact, it was, I think, Bobby Kennedy and others who persuaded Jack Kennedy to just slow down here a little bit. And LeMay was ready to go to war. Okay, that's not necessarily, well, I guess the question is, what's your assessment of LeMay? Number two, is the SAC command seen as a plum by Air Force personnel? That's the second. And if it is, how do you become commander of SAC?
Okay. I'm going to go in reverse order. How do you become commander of Strategic Air Command? Early on, they were looking for someone who could achieve the goal of the Pentagon, of the military. General Kennedy was not that person. General Kennedy had an incredible history within World War II and World War I, but by then he was winding down. He did not have it in him to just build an organization from next to nothing. When you look at it, when SAC was started out, they had under 300 aircraft in their entire arsenal, and that was spread out over 16 bases. By 1962, they had just over 3,000 aircraft spread over 40 bases in the U.S. and 20 overseas. So they had to make that jump. Kennedy was not that yet. LeMay was. LeMay was an innovator. And LeMay was very good at getting into a single mindset. He did not take the Soviets personally. He was given a mission to create a deterrent force that would keep the Soviets from launching a nuclear war against us. And that's what he did. Now, when you get into the Cuban Missile Crisis, the view on that is, yes, LeMay was arguing for a strike. He said it's time to just take them out. They're putting something within 90 miles of us. That's putting us at risk. He's looking at it from a military point of view. He did not ever really let his personal feelings or his personal views go into that. He was given a mission to protect the United States. That's what he did was the best thing. Now, was it good for Robert Kennedy and other advisors to pull President Kennedy back a bit and say, let's hold on a bit? Yes, it was very, very good for them to do that. One is, history's already proven it. The Soviet Union was ready to launch some submarine missiles at the United States. They were ready to take out our ships. But there was one Soviet lieutenant, or lieutenant equivalent, on their submarines, in order to launch nuclear weapons, you had to have the consent of 3 people. One is the captain of the boat, the other one is the weapons officer of the boat, and then there was a political commissioner, they called it, that was on every ship. The captain and the political commissioner said, let's launch it. The third guy would not do it, and it turned out that kept that from escalating also. So convincing President Kennedy to be patient and give the Soviets some time to find a way out without losing a lot of face was very good. LeMay was prepared to launch, and it's good that he did. Now, LeMay as a person, again, as I've already talked about, very incredible mind. He's the one who said in Europe, why are we flying our B-17s in a zigzag motion to avoid this anti-aircraft fire? It does nothing for us on the bombing accuracy. We're going to end up sending those fighters back 3 or 4 times to do the mission, greater chance of losing it. Fly straight in, drop your bombs, and then get out. And it worked. Yes, we lost a lot of service members, but it helped take away the advantage the Germans had as far as building more war material. In the Pacific, he took the B-29, designed to fly at a higher altitude and drop at night. He said, or during the day. He said, why? He assessed the Japanese on what defenses they had. He said, we don't need to fly high, we can fly low. and we'll fly at night, and instead of trying to pinpoint our bombs, we're going to firebomb them. All of their war industry was in structures built of wood and paper. He goes, you set them on fire, the whole city burns, and they've got nothing. It wasn't that he wanted to kill Japanese, he wanted to end the war. That was his mission. And I've had the benefit of also learning more about his personal life. He was a great family man. He had a daughter, Jane, that I've talked with her before, and she said, oh, he was a wonderful dad. He doted on me whenever he was around. Always had time for me, do what I want to do. He didn't wear his rank all the time. Many former veterans of Offutt, they talk about LeMay loved cars. You look back at his history, when he's in college, he built his own Model T out of spare parts. He loved racing. He would build go-karts and things to race those. He actually started the SAC, it was a racing series going to different bases to raise money for enlisted housing. There's many stories where he would be at a base, usually at Offutt, wanting to work on his car. His chief of staff, who was an enlisted gentleman, would always be there with him, and they would work on cars together. And an airman whose car dies on him is trying to push it in, calls inside to ask him if he can help him. Both of them come out and they help push the car inside. And when he realizes it's the general, he's like, oh, General, I'm very sorry. He goes, no, I'm not in uniform. Right now, I'm just Kirk. And so he was very humble, but he had this ability to just really focus on the mission and do that. At the end of the day, to do from off and all went well. All right, any other questions? All right.
I have
Oh, I'm sorry.
a silly one.
Oh,
Did you
no.
say that one of those missiles was named Snark?
Yes, Snark. That was the name of it. It was not an acronym, it's just the name they gave it. What's interesting is the Snark, since it was our first sort of ballistic missile, it was very, very difficult for them in the development, as is the first of anything. It takes a lot of trial and error. Well, it was down around Cape Canaveral that they would test launch these. And the reason is they test launch them out over the ocean, they're not going to hit anything. Well, they had done so many that the Navy was referring to it as Snark infested waters. And by the time they got, and what's interesting, I don't want to jump in and go time, what's interesting is how did the U.S. develop our missiles? While they're developing Snark, they're also developing Atlas. In case Snark didn't work, they would have the Atlas. And they had already started on Titan, which was going to be a replacement for Atlas. So they have all these going on at the same time. That helps us ramp up our technology, our arsenal, a whole lot faster than how this would be.
That's great. I think that's our prompt. Oh,
Okay.
Well,
Can it
this
be
is,
1 minute?
going back to the lieutenant who would go along. You know the specifics of that, but he not opened the safe with the codes or?
Yes, it's my understanding of it, everything I've read on it, is they all have keys to open the safe, to get the codes to launch. He would not relinquish that. He says, no, I won't do it. And fortunately, again, you know, I know that in the movies, the Soviets were very evil overbearers and things, and that in the movies they probably would have just shot him and taken the key or beaten him up or something. They didn't do that. They understood their protocols. I think partially they looked at it and said, okay, if we forcibly take it from him, we do this and it's wrong, we're dead. They won't punish us, they'll just kill us. That's it. So they look at it this way, but it was also they understood that this is our protocol, we need to follow this. What if he's right? And it turned out he was.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.